The stories shared in this podcast reflect personal experiences and perspectives. While names and identifying details may be changed, these accounts are told truthfully to the best of our knowledge. Nothing in this podcast should be taken as fact about any specific individual or organisation without independent verification. Our intention is to share experiences, not to cause harm or defame. This podcast deals with themes of emotional abuse, manipulation, and deception. We share these stories not to sensationalize, but to understand how it happens, why it's so hard to see from the inside, and what it takes to break free. Please take care while listening.
I can't forget what you said. It was reckless to use those words. Now I'm stuck on you, and I keep having these dreams where you run away from me, and I know it's not real, but I'm lost on how to
By the time Jess was on the other side of the world, the pattern was already clear. Every time Danni made a choice, someone else carried the consequence. The drugs, the abuse, the lies. And like always, just as the consequences had started to land, a reinvention, a new story, a new self. The point was no longer what he had done, it was who Jess was willing to be for him. The focus shifted once again off his behaviour and onto her response. Would she accept him? Support him? Would she stay? Because when someone has made systematically breaking you down an Olympic sport, choices don't feel like free will, they feel like betrayal. So how do you choose yourself when you're no longer sure where they end and you begin? Okay, so let's talk about choices. So Jess, when we left the story, Danni had just been discharged from hospital after a particularly horrific low point. An alleged violent assault, possession of enough of a Class A drug to make a reasonable person concerned for their future, and a major, significant revelation to you that he would be becoming a woman that Sunday. A statement that, like so many things, Danni said, quickly unraveled as just another act in a pattern of manipulation.
It's a hard time to look back on and try and find solid ground to stand on and say this is exactly what happened, because what it was from my perspective and how often I was trying to make it normal. In my memory, one moment I'm in the airport at Crete waiting to head to our next destination, and I'm texting him and it's all fine, and we're joking and we're talking about me being a glutton because I'm chowing down on donuts. And then the next minute I'm in the back of this car with Wayne and my auntie and my uncle, and it's a fun, beautiful road trip on this beautiful Euro trip I'm on. And then the next minute I get a text message from my boyfriend telling me he's going to become a woman. And it's really hard to describe how I was feeling at that point. I think defeated is a good word. I think somewhat indifferent at that point. I don't think whatever he was doing didn't shock me anymore. I was just so desperate to be normal in this relationship. And yeah, that was the moment that I got hit, and I kind of just said, I can't have that quiet anymore.
And I think that's such an interesting point, Jess, because we use the word normal, but what's true for this relationship you were in is that the normal was the insanity. So all of the bizarreness and the drama, that was the normal state, but it wasn't your normal. And so when you say things like that, it's like you're just looking for the quiet and that overwhelming of cortisol from the craziness felt temporary, but it was actually the mainstay of your relationship.
It was, and I think we've said in previous episodes, I cannot survive in chaos, but he thrives in it. And so he had done the thing where he'd brought it to this normalized chaos. Our relationship was a cycle of chaos, and that's where he had his power. You know, my nervous system was shot by this point, and I can remember that feeling deeply. I can remember just being exhausted. You know, you got a really important meeting or something at work, and you come out of it and you feel like, holy moly, I feel like I've just run a marathon, and I just felt like I was consistently running marathons. This moment in the car, I remember getting that message. It was kinda like, usually I'd wanna keep going back to him and trying to find a part where we were quiet again, but I just gave up. I just let go, and it wasn't an angry let go. I was like, "You wanna do this thing? I will be here, I will be your friend. I'm not going to commit my own emotions and my own nervous system to this next piece of chaos."
And I think that's something when I think about this time, I had this overwhelming hope for you, and I've talked to people who love you since then, and I know that they had the same hope that you were literally on the other side of the planet. You know what I mean? And I really felt like it could go one of 2 ways. You wouldn't go, and I think we've spoken about that on the podcast before, or that you would go and you would have this amazing break from it, and then you would think, "What the hell is going on?" all the fucking time, and it would give you that sense of distance that you needed. But he managed to just amp it up. It really went to 11. He really turned it into just the craziest kind of drama he possibly could, and it makes me so mad because he kinda ruined your holiday. I mean, it was beautiful, and we both know that, but still feels like he ruined your holiday.
He had access to my brain 24/7. You know, we all have phones and we are so accessible with our phones. He occupied my brain. He lived in there. Whether or not he was talking to me, I was constantly thinking about him. Yeah, there was no way for me to get away. I could have gone to Mars, I think, and it still wouldn't have made a difference. He was gonna do the thing that he was gonna do, and he sure as shit did it.
So you said at the end of the last episode that he lost it at you after your message in response to his, "I'm going to become a woman on Sunday," letting him know that while for you, as a heterosexual woman, your romantic relationship would need to end at that point, but that you would support him through the transition as a friend. What did you mean by that? Do you think he lost it at you because you suggested ending the relationship?
Yeah, this was part of a theme, right? And you know, we know a lot more now than what I did at the time, but I think in some ways he set things up. So he would say these things that he knew I wouldn't be willing to compromise on. He knew I had boundaries, and I think this was one of those boundary pushing moments. And also, we know exactly what he was doing that weekend now. We found
Mhm.
evidence since. And so it's wild to think in my head, why did he say that to me? Why, at that moment, after we'd been joking and been fine, do this wild shit about him, you know, arrests and overdoses and hotel rooms. And then we finally found this place of, okay, we're okay, everybody's safe, everybody's nervous system is calm. And it's like I'm becoming a woman. Why would he tell me that just out of the blue for no particular reason, but just to tell me that? And so it was him setting me up to reject him so that he can escalate and get angry at me for rejecting him. And that's what happened.
The message he sent you really occupies a lot of my brain in this. Do you mind just reading out exactly the words that he used?
Sure. So we're looking at a timeline. You know, I'm overseas and it was pretty late at night for where I was. And I think in Australia, we're looking 3:30 a.m. in the morning. So when I was talking to him and we were joking and everything was fine, we're looking about 3:30 a.m. We say goodnight. And my last message to him is a love heart. And then an hour later, so at 4:30 a.m., I get a message saying, "I going to be a woman this Sunday." The next message is the one that I think tipped me over the edge, where he says, "I don't know how that makes you feel or if it's even your business, but I am."
The thing that bothers me is the choice of language. I don't know how this makes you feel or if it's even any of your business. Why would it not be your business?
And that's the interesting part, right? The tone in that message kind of sounds like some kind of threat. Maybe threat's the wrong word. It sounds really aggressive to me. And it did at the time. It hit me really hard.
And I just think the total disregard for your role in the relationship as well, by essentially, if you take this as a genuine message from your partner, letting you know that they're about to enter a transition phase, that's a major moment in a relationship. And there is a lot of opportunity for open discussion and loving discussion about how it impacts you both. And he prefaces it by saying, I don't even know if this is your business to know. Again, why would it not be your business? The total lack of regard for you as a human being with human emotion and human experience. And as the other part of a partnership is so loud in this and so disrespectful to you, but also to what he was proclaiming to do you mind reading out what he said after your message back to him?
Yeah, and I must say, by this point, I had learned to be very cautious with how I engaged with anything he said, particularly around what he wanted to do or what his desires were. And so, this is coming off the back of months of provocation and then punishment for my response. And so I was really careful. And so I just said, okay. And he says, no sex involved, no drugs. And I said to him, can I ask why? Because I was wondering, what are you doing here? Are you wanting to become a woman or are you just
Mm.
having a fun dress up?
And he'd been really loud about his sexuality the entire time. So it's one of those things that, I mean, it doesn't come completely from left field, but it's also a pretty uh big thing to come forward with. So there's a tone there of exploration and sort of saying, is this part of your sexual exploration or is this you actually letting me know that you're about to transition?
That's where we led, right? So, I asked that question, can I ask why? And then I didn't hear from him for a minute, and then he's like, "Sorry, I'm asleep." And so just automatically throwing me in all kinds of ways. And so then he's like, "For fun, for identity exploration." I said, "You're exploring your gender identity?" And he said, "Yep." And I was like, "Okay." I said, "My darling Danny, I love you and I want to support you, but you're on a journey that I'm just going to get in the way of." There's a few messages deleted here, so I can't recall exactly what his response was at this point, but he's like, "Oh, okay." And then I said, "I fell in love with a man and I am a straight woman." And then he says immediately, "Okay, goodbye." The most toxic. Goodbye. And then I just said, "I can be in your life." And then this is where I start panicking. This is the cycle, right? I start panicking because I've done the wrong thing, clearly. And then he's like, "It's just fucking makeup and some clothes." And I said, "You're exploring your gender identity, Danny." And he said, "I'm just exploring. You've left me. You left me again, fucking again." And then I just said, "I don't want to get in your way anymore." And then it was just hours. There's hundreds of text messages here of him just saying horrid things to me about me abandoning him. And then he just starts minimizing what he said in the first place, just some fucking clothes and makeup. I just wanted to have fun with makeup. And then it's kind of like, I'm sick of getting in your way, Danny. Like, let me go. Just let me go. And it was kind of that kind of pull.
And it's incredibly disrespectful to people who are genuinely going through a transition to minimize it and say it's just some fucking clothes and makeup.
But it is entirely exploitative in my mind what was happening. I was really trying to understand at this point. Like, this wasn't me having a tanty because my boyfriend wants to put on a dress. So we hit a point where we get back to that mantra that he'd said to me way back in the beginning of our relationship, which was, join me. If you don't want to join me, support me. If you don't want to support me, get out of my way. And I was at the point where I was just getting out of his way. I couldn't support him anymore. I was ready to opt out, and it wasn't a complete abandonment. I would have sat by him and supported him through that. However, I don't think I truly believed he wanted to actually become a woman. I think he was trying to provoke me. I think I saw it as him wanting to keep me on edge. I think he kept wanting to push my limits. And I knew by this point, this is what our relationship had become. Or it was the entire time. I don't know. It just felt like everything was a trap.
I think he just didn't want you to ask him questions about why he was in the hotel room and what had actually happened there.
Which also makes a lot of sense. Given what we know now, that makes entire sense, yes. I guess I understood he was always going to be this epicenter of chaos, and I knew he'd lied to me about having cancer at the beginning. I knew he was abusive at this point. I knew he was using hard drugs, and I knew my need for this order and calm was going to trigger him constantly, or maybe just give him that lever that he needed to feel whatever he needed to feel at any given time. And I'd been this dish sponge. I'd been soaking it all up for so long, and so I'd reached this point. I couldn't take it anymore, but on the other hand, man, I fucking loved him, and I had faith in this potential of what we could be. He sold me so much potential and this forever love and this family that we were gonna have one day. My heart bled for him. I think it's important to note this guy was mimicking so much of what my father was as well, and so I was wired to feel hurt and empathy for him. And I could see his life blowing up in front of me. I could see this repeat of history that my father had done. And so I wanted so badly to fix it, but I just couldn't. And so at this point, there was nothing I could do but walk away.
You know, there's an interesting thing I'm reflecting on as you say this. There's a moment when we had a very tough conversation, which we'll come to later in this episode, and you were talking about this sort of thing, about how much you loved him, and I remember saying to you, "You say that you love him, but when you're with him, what does that feel like? When you're with him and you're looking at him, do you feel madly in love?" And you said to me, "No, I feel awful."
Yeah. That's really interesting because when I look back, there's a lot of hindsight here, but there's also a lot of glorifying, maybe. I think I look back and I want to believe that there was this mad love between us. And there were moments, absolutely. There were moments I recall him being at my house with his children, and I just hadn't felt so much love for
Mm.
someone. That performance, and I call it a performance now because of all of the choices he made, can't possibly make that sincere, but it felt so beautiful to me, and I just adored who he was in those moments, in those performative moments. That sort of hijacks my memories for the sake of survivals, for the sake of coping. But you're right, a lot of the time it was high stress. It was a lot of anger towards me. It was a lot of punishment. It was a nervous system explosion most of the time, and it felt awful.
And I think from the outside looking in, there are a lot of reasons to understand why this moment felt like the time to walk away. But for you, why was this the breaking point? Do you think being on the other side of the world helped with that, or was it the context?
I think a lot changed that night. I think after abusing me via text message for hours, he started to realize this cycle that I was in with him had broken. This indifference had taken over me. I felt relief that I had finally let go. It felt like he really started panicking at this point. He completely flipped. He turned into the other version of him, this helpless, I'll do better version. When I was in the car and he was texting, he'd said to me, I'm contacting Kigs and I'm contacting your mother. And I was, do not contact the people in my life. I have landed here because I've landed here. I don't need you to pull people in to convince me otherwise. But what really pushed me over the edge was him texting my mum. And he basically pleaded for her to help, telling her that I continue to break up with him anytime that he exposed a desire or a part of his identity to me that I didn't like. And honestly, I don't know what he thought he'd achieve by contacting my mum. Perhaps he wanted to humiliate me. Perhaps that was the intention. Perhaps he truly believed she'd side with him. But these were things that I didn't want my mum to have to absorb. She'd already gone to hospital and picked him up and had to hear these things from me about me thinking he was escorting. This was a tumultuous week for my mom, and so that shocked me, that annoyed me, that angered me. Why did he have to bring her into this? And so my mum, in her truly restrained way, just simply told him, Jessie's an adult. She makes her own choices, and put that to bed. But I think it was quite shocking what he said for my mum to read.
How did your mum react to you about all of it?
I think she had thought some things. So in his message to her, he kind of broke down a lot of what had happened. Like, I wanted to do OnlyFans with Jessie and she broke up with me because I wanted to do that. And so my poor mum is like, holy shit, what is happening to my daughter? Is my daughter doing OnlyFans with this guy? I think she had a moment of, oh shit, but I think she knew deep down it wasn't me.
Let's just make it really clear. You did not do OnlyFans.
I did not do OnlyFans. My reasons for not wanting to do OnlyFans stand. And look, frankly, hats off to people who can do that. I don't have the confidence to have that part of me out on the internet for all to see. But yeah, I think while my mum was stunned by what he had said to her, I think maybe she was relieved knowing that I'd finally ended this relationship. I think that was the biggest emotion for her. I don't want to speak on her behalf, but I think that's where she was at after she'd checked with me and said, hey, you know, the internet's forever.
It is forever. It really, really is. And I love how your mum always maintained the line with him of choices and consequences, Danni.
She did. My mum is a firm believer in we make choices and we need to be responsible for those and deal with the consequences of our choices. And he fucking hated that. But coming from my mum, he couldn't really fight back. I think at this point, I think he knew she could see through him. I think he had learned enough about my family and my father and her relationship with him. I think he knew my mum had this bullshit meter built in and he couldn't pull the wool over her eyes. So choices and consequences, Danni.
Choices and consequences, Danni. So you've ended the relationship, but that's not the end of the story by, a country mile. Where do we go next?
Well, it didn't take long for him to start on his remedial action. He, within a few hours of begging and tears over the phone, and I was just exhausted at this point. I hadn't slept for a while. We were back to calm and friendly. He basically broke me down until I caved. And I think I caved under this pure need for rest, for quiet. I think I was spent. And we went back to talking about easy things. We went back to talking about his bathroom renos and his promises to get shit done and focus on cleaning up this dumpster fire of a life he'd fostered for the last 7 months.
It's interesting as well because at this time, I mean, you and I were only really talking sporadically because you were, of course, in Europe and you were sending me beautiful pictures of, beers on the beach and gorgeous sunsets and things like that. And then you sent me a text one day that wasn't about goat's cheese stuffed figs with honey, but that simply said, "Hey girl, if Danni contacts you, please ignore him. I have ended our relationship. I apologize in advance if he does." So I'm curious to understand, you've gone back into this place of friendly and calm. Did that mean that you were back together at that point? Because it didn't look like it outwardly.
No, not at all. And I remember when I sent you that text, and that was when we were in the calm. That was after everything. And I needed to publicize that. I needed to tell people. I needed it to be the end. And it was for me. But it didn't mean I was abandoning him. I couldn't let go of him that easy. It was, I truly did love this guy and I wanted him to change. And I left him a number of times. And I think each time I had hoped that the shock of losing me, in my naivety now, understanding how unimportant that is to him. But I thought the shock of him losing me would make him change. I thought it would make him want to be better for his children, at least. That would be a good outcome for me. And so we went back together, but we weren't fighting, and that felt really nice. I also felt relief. I felt like the weight of responsibility had been lifted. I didn't feel like I had to monitor him anymore to the degree I was monitoring him. So, yeah, I texted you. I publicized it. I thought I was being cool, and I remember that exact morning I had walked out of the room I was in, and my uncle came up to me, and he just said to me, "Jess, are you okay?" And I was like, "Oh, fuck. They can see it now." Whoopsie, I wasn't putting on a good show. I think they kinda knew something was wrong the entire time. But, at that moment, I was kinda like, "I'm gonna be." And I said to him, "Yeah, it's all good," because I really believed it was gonna be fine from that point. I thought I was free.
Do you think he believed that you were really broken up? What was his demeanor at the time? What were you talking about?
Again, in hindsight, I think he knew exactly what the fuck he was doing. I think he had gotten to a point of enjoying the game a little bit. I think it was enjoyable for him. You know, we talk about trauma bonds and the addictive cycle of the rise in stress and then the, comfort. I think as much as I had been trauma bonded, I think he was addicted to the game of losing me and then having to pull me back in again. And so I think it just became part of his game and he enjoyed it. And sounds really awful, but how can someone treat someone that way? I can never understand. And so I think he knew that in my heart I had gone, but I think he was like, but I'm going to get her back. So for the rest of the European trip, he was speaking with me quite regularly. And, he'd talk with this determination to be better. He had this sweetness and he was really committed, as if what I had thought was true, this fear of him losing me had caused this great epiphany in him. And, a rupture in this line of chaos that had been building this really fast momentum. And I supported him. I was encouraging and assuring him that he could change all the things he wanted and he could have control of his life again for him and his children. And I would support him through that.
I mean, if only you really knew what was going on behind the text message facade, though, right? Because what's so infuriating is that we now know what he was actually getting up to around that time. We know what he was really doing and how little value he was placing on getting his shit together, to quote him, and refocusing on his children and being well. And it is just so diabolical.
Yeah, it truly is. It didn't take long for the hostility to return. I think once he knew that I was back in this full I'm supporting Danny mode, he would take the opportunity to pick fights whenever he could. And mind you, I was treading super carefully at this point. Like I knew that any misstep could rupture, but once he was off, there was just no bringing him back. And no amount of apology would repair any offense against Danny. I'd just have to wait until he realized he was done punishing me. And so that cycle really quickly came back into the fold.
Did that change how you engaged with him, though? Because at this point in time, you were just friends, really. I mean, you weren't in an active relationship. So there's a difference between a friend flipping out and calling you controlling and treating you like dirt and your boyfriend doing it. I think that you can put in place boundaries a little bit more strongly sometimes for whatever reason if it's a friend. Were you still in the cycle of, no, everything's fine, you're right, I'm the problem here, I'll be less controlling? Or were you holding more firm?
No, I was really well trained by this point, and even though we weren't in a relationship, the responsibility that I thought had lifted off my shoulders came back very quickly. I was still really concerned about his mental health. I was still really concerned about his suicidal ideation. I didn't want to do anything that would push him over the edge. And I'd already left him. I'd already abandoned him. I think the responsibility was more me being relieved that I don't have to be worried that he's out sleeping with someone else anymore. That was the relief for me. It wasn't I don't have to be responsible for keeping him alive anymore. It was that, oh no, deception's okay now because he won't be deceiving me because we're not in a relationship. That was the relief. Somehow, very craftily, he'd kind of entirely flipped this narrative where I had become really controlling and I had him walking on eggshells. And so he had turned it into me being this restrictive person in his life that was keeping him on a couch. And that he'd literally say to me, I don't know what to do. I can't leave my couch because I'm so worried I'll do the wrong thing for you. And so it was a really challenging dynamic for me to navigate because we clearly wanted different things. And, whenever I'd set a boundary, he was devastated because it was that, I was not accepting him for who he was.
The whole thing just feels like him saying, imagine the life we could have had together if you could only have accepted me and loved me properly.
Pretty much. But, and I think about this analogy a lot to help understand what it was like. And it's like, it's like a serial killer coming to you and saying, I murder people on the daily and I like doing it. You need to accept the fact that I murder people or you don't love me. I don't know. That's a terrible analogy because who could love a serial
No, I
killer?
understand it. I get well, I mean, many people do, Ted Bundy. But
Yeah, true.
what I think is interesting in this, you know who you are. That's one thing I've always known to be true for you. But when you look back at this time and you see yourself tentatively put in place these boundaries and then immediately go, "Oh, no, does that not work for you?" What does that feel like in reflection?
I can look back now and see it really clearly, exactly what was happening. And so I look back and I go, okay, well, I had left him. I set the ultimate boundary. I said, enough's enough. I didn't abandon him. I had just ended our romantic relationship. He then flipped that entirely. And because I'd found this power in me, he wanted me to feel guilty for putting that boundary in place. He suddenly became the ultimate victim of me because of my boundary. So it was punishment for putting in that boundary. You've told me you can't be with me. You've left me. And so now I'm going to go right over here. And he'd go on about being really scared about doing anything. He told me he didn't even think he could have friends because of me, because of my judgment of him. And so he made it sound like I was truly awful. And that because I'd set that boundary, because I'd said, hey, I don't want that in my life, that I had then put these shackles on him and I started keeping him locked up because he was so afraid that he'd do things that weren't within my boundaries. And so I can see what he was doing. He was setting it up because he knows I'm controlled by guilt. He knows empathy controls me. And so if he makes me feel guilty for that boundary, then I'm going to submit. I'm going to lift those boundaries a little bit. And I fucking did. He knew exactly what he was doing.
But I think that that is part of his MO more broadly. If you step into the place that we are now and the full reflection mode, he has an unique ability to blame a particular situation or a particular person for his downfall. And that is so true of every aspect of his life. And I think he does it with that same kind of magnanimous, I could be so many things, fall in love with my potential or believe in my potential, that you were always looking for the person to blame. And in your situation, the person to blame was you because you really didn't know you were entrenched in his life, but you didn't know enough about him and his people and his past. You knew fragments, things that he wanted you to know, but not really. So you were the obvious choice. And again, thinking about all the different stories, there was always someone else who started to push him over the cliff. To your mum's point, choices and consequences. Everybody has the ability to reel themselves back in, and particularly someone with all of the knowledge and all of the education and all of the privilege, as Danny has, can reel themselves back in eventually. But if we look to where we are, again in Europe, how did that end? Because this is only a month. We're only a month in Europe and so much has happened and you've ended the relationship and had all of these revelations. Talk to me about those last few days.
I think I was under the false impression that I had some kind of control of myself over those last few days when I was in Europe. A very insightful person recently said to us, you don't compromise on your boundaries. And that's language that I wish I had in my toolkit at the time because there were things going on that I should never have compromised on. And these were boundaries that I had put in place, not for fun, not for preference, but to feel safe. And I really started compromising on those. My mum had said something to me once about, if you take someone back after they've deceived you, they will lose all respect for you and it will never be the same again. And I think that's exactly what happened. The last few days were super challenging emotionally for me. We had gone from me feeling empowered to say enough's enough, I can't do this anymore, to our relationship getting extremely volatile again. This was a matter of days. This is not large periods of time. This was happening really quickly. You can't imagine what that does to someone and the strength within someone. You start to feel really weak really quickly. You start to judge your own character. I was really exhausted. I was really sick. I got another virus and I was really sad too. I was grieving the loss of a relationship as well. And so I recall Danny had video called me about something else, and I saw the side of his house in the background, and it was completely trashed. I started to feel these intense waves of guilt. Like the guilt just came hard and fast, and I felt really hopeless, and I just wanted to go home and I just wanted to clean up his life again. I had moved immediately back into this fixer role. I thought I'd changed this cycle. I thought the trajectory had changed, but in fact, we were in the very same cycle we'd always been in.
An interesting aspect of Danny's personality is how well he could so firmly hold on to a point of view or a lie or a feeling, and despite every piece of evidence to the contrary, he would live out the emotions like he wasn't just completely full of shit, like cancer. Even confronted eventually with, did you actually have cancer? It's like it didn't happen to him, but he could so easily attach truth to it and just live it out. He would commit to the absolute garbage lie and ignore all of the horrible shit that he was really doing and behave like he was the one who'd been slighted, or he was the one who had really believed in the love of it all. I find that completely terrifying and fascinating to reflect on.
I think it was all part of his game, right? He seemed to enjoy dropping the ball and then having to get it back again. And each time the play would change a little bit more. We'd hit this point where I had left and I was there to support him still and I was being firm, and then the game started and he got me back. He pulled me back in, and at this point he started bringing in the premise of unconditional love. And so it was another, another gameplay, another piece of arsenal for him. And so I really started jumping into these concepts and pulling myself apart over them. What does it mean to have unconditional love? And it wasn't just unconditional love for him. There were little people that he brought into this relationship. And it feels really shitty to say it's a game, because I want to believe that he believed it. But knowing everything we know now, I just can't possibly think that this was sincere. I think it was all designed to get me back in the position he wanted to get me back into. He started weaving into conversation, saying things like, "What do you think I need to do to belong with you unconditionally?" And then it moved on to this acceptance, the idea of acceptance. I don't accept him. He loved me and he accepted me for whatever I presented, which, side note, no, he fucking didn't. But I didn't accept him. I was trapped because I either agreed with every decision that he made or every desire that he presented. And let's face it, there were a lot of them that weren't great at this point. Or I didn't accept him and I was destroying any kind of hope of a relationship. And somehow, all while I finished my European holiday, he completely flipped the scenario of me ending our relationship, recognizing that we want different things, and I was in his way. He'd flipped it to, if we were to stay together, I would have to be ready to accept and respect him. He was a true master of spin, and it blows my mind because I had firmly left this relationship, and then all of a sudden I had to be proving myself to be in a relationship with him. And I just don't know how we got there.
So obviously, you returned to Australia and so much has happened. And that sort of leads us into a pretty interesting moment in our dynamic through this, because we'd arranged to catch up and there was a lot of things I was interested in understanding, mostly that you were okay after everything you had shared with me.
The last communication I recall having with you was confirming our relationship was over. I think before we keep going, this is probably a good place to take a pause, because this story isn't just about me. It's also about the people inside it who are watching someone they love get pulled further into something that they can't name yet. And for you, Keeks, I feel like we've told this story mostly from inside my body, my perspective, but you were living your own version of it. I would like if we could flip this script for a little bit and talk about what it's like for people sitting in your position.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's extraordinarily hard to watch someone that you love go through something like you went through, but it happened to you. So I want to keep that central to this next conversation. Okay, so we had this entire podcast, and so much of it sounds like I was so gentle and supportive and there for you 100% of the time. But that's not disingenuous because I always was, but it wasn't always as easy as saying I 100% support you all of the time. There were parts of it where I couldn't show up for you in the way that I wanted to because it was really, really hard to do that.
People talk a lot about how hard it is to exist in and leave abusive relationships, but I think for the sake of awareness, and that's what we're trying to achieve here, no one really talks in depth about how hard it is to stand beside it, to watch someone who hasn't left yet. So, I guess what I want to ask you, and we've agreed to be really honest and transparent in this, what was it like for you watching from the sidelines? How did it feel for you?
I'm going to be really, really honest through it. There were moments, particularly I'd say around this time, where I didn't think our friendship would survive through it because I could see what was happening and I didn't know all of it. And that's what's so terrifying for me now is that in going through this, and even before the podcast, in the way that you started to share with me the real of it and to stand beside you as you started to tell the real story to so many people, there was so much I just didn't know. And I would think so much about how I was just carrying on in my quiet little life while all of these awful, horrific things were happening to you, feeling scared for you or wondering what was going on, but not really knowing.
There was a lot going on that I didn't tell people about. It was that I was trying to convince everyone that everyone should empathize with him, but not everyone was caught in the same cycle I was. Part of these relationships is that you lose your identity entirely, you become a part of them. And I think by this point, my sense of self was gone. My sole purpose for existing was to keep Danny's head above water. And that's got to be real shitty to watch your friend
Yeah,
go through.
shitty's really a very gentle way of saying it, but, we spoke about in,
Yeah.
I think, the very first episode, your date, the first date you went on with Danny, you shared your location, and it was all a bit of a joke at the time, and there came a point, and it was much, much before this, where if I knew that you were going to see him, I would obsessively check your location, and I didn't really know what that was about. I just didn't know how to know where you were physically or emotionally, and I could brace myself for how much I needed to wrap myself around you. Because again, let's not forget we worked together as well, right? So it wasn't just as a supporter in your life, it was also someone who we spend so much of our time at work. It was how much I needed to wrap around you on Monday morning, how much I needed to, create quiet moments for you or allow you just moments to be quiet or prepare myself to go to bat for someone I fucking loathed, not you, Danny. I fucking loathed Danny. And so to come back to this place that we were in, when you sent me that message while you were away, I just felt so much relief because I know you and I know you're a beautiful soul and you look after people. And I knew it couldn't be the end, but I desperately wanted that to be the end. And I really did feel that maybe the distance coupled with whatever he was going to create could be the thing. And so I went into our catch up post Europe with ulterior motives. I wanted to know if you were genuinely not together anymore. I didn't know how to prepare myself for you telling me that you had made up.
That was a little bit of an awkward conversation between us, and I think I felt the awkwardness, and I think you felt the awkwardness because you were always really careful about not saying anything too aggressive, not being too excited either, I think, about the end of our relationship.
I don't think I ever said it to you. I never did the classic thing of, oh God, I always hated that guy because I didn't think you could ever hear it really until you were ready to hear it. I probed a lot during that discussion to try to find out, and I was probably more pointed and spiky than I had been at that point in our friendship, I think, really, but you were still very much Danny-centered, and I think that was the thing. We spoke pretty much solely about Danny at that time and what was going on. And it was an interesting story, I won't lie, there was plenty to talk about, right? Let's not pretend it was an interesting conversation. But you were Danny, and that was to be your support person was to be Danny's support person, and it was this is a shit thing for me to say, and you know I say it with so much love. It was getting really, really hard to continue to support Danny, and I could see what he was doing to you. And I think the way I approached that in that conversation was to sort of gently remind you that not all love stories are long and that sometimes you shift gears and that can be for good reasons and bad reasons and you can just move in and out of people's lives. And I don't think it was the right thing to do, and I feel all the time like I should have just been firmer, but I also feel like that would have been the wrong thing to do. I don't know what the right way to approach it was, but I know I left that meeting thinking, "He's going to kill her." I had this really deep feeling in me that he would either physically end your life or he would mentally end your life.
I mean, that's pretty huge, thinking about your friend and thinking about their possible demise. And really, there's not a lot you can do because I was at a point where essentially I was trying to convince you to have empathy for this person that was destroying me. And, you've talked about how it's really hard to find that balance. You can't push too hard, but you so desperately want to. You feel, you can see what's happening here and all you want to do is scream, get out, but you can't. And so putting me aside for you as an individual, how did you deal with that? How did you deal with caring for someone deeply and seeing this future and not being able to do anything about it? How did you cope?
It's a really tough question to answer. I just felt scared for you all the time, but I couldn't understand it. And I think that that's the other aspect of this is that I didn't know how to understand it really. And the depth of confusion and how tumultuous these kind of relationships are is so difficult to pinpoint, but it's sure as shit hard to look at when it's happening and go, oh no, I understand completely. And she's going through what she needs to, because our instinct is to protect. So we want to stand in front and we want to say to the person who is hurting the person we love, can you back the fuck off? Don't touch them again. Don't call them again. Don't come back here kind of vibe. But you just can't do it. And so I didn't know what it was going to feel like to watch you walk away from yourself more or to physically exit. And my own protection method was to start to create some kind of distance, but also double down in protection. So I felt like all the time I was, no, I'm 100% in this, but back off a little bit. It was really confusing. And I think the hardest thing is to watch someone go through something you have absolutely no ability to stop for them.
Truly, it's fucking terrifying. Sometimes you can't wrap the bubble wrap around the person and make sure nothing's going to hurt them.
There's a thing that we say a lot, which is all waves. A wave is a building thing and you get dunked. And there's a moment where you're not sure if you're going to be able to come up for air, but you believe in the fact that you will. And there was never a time where I didn't really want to believe in your ability to come up for air at the end of it. And that's what I held on to. But I think that that is true for everybody who loved you, is that we were waiting for you to come up for air from the tidal wave that was Danny. And it was a bit of a mental chess game. Not that I ever really felt like I could say something to you that would make you shut down, but I was afraid of saying something to you that would make you shut down, because I really do think that if I had said something at some point, which I never did, you would have listened to it and heard it. It just would have taken a little while to come back around to it. But there are a lot of people I know who are potentially quite critical of the things I didn't say to you, or could say, why didn't you just tell her to leave? And I did in my own way. I did in a way that I thought that you could hear it. But how do you know what to say? Because if I had sat you down and said, Jess, I think that Danny is going to kill you. Please, would you leave? You wouldn't have done it. it just would have closed a door. And so in navigating that for me, the only way that I felt like I could keep you safe was to know what was going on with you and to not turn off the communication line and to not push too hard to make you feel like you couldn't tell me things. I think that if people had just walked away, it would have been way too easy for you to just stay.
Yeah, I will happily admit, I think the reason why I got out was because I just wasn't isolated. I had this independence that he just couldn't crack. And I often do reflect back and go, imagine if I lived on my own. Imagine what would have happened if I lived in a house on my own. Imagine if I didn't have a workmate that was observing me every week. Just imagine. It was really bad in the situation I was in. Can you imagine what it
Uh,
would have been like?
I actually can't. And there is a moment that I think about so often now, and it was before you went to Europe where you were telling me he had been talking to you about how much chaos his business was in and had said to you, it would be great if you could go part-time in your work life and come and work a few days for me. And you were really, truly considering it. And I, not to toot my own horn, I actually think that that was an attempt that he made to isolate you from me for more of the week because he had done a pretty good job of putting in place some barriers and you were not isolated at all because the people who love you, and so many of them we have heard from in doing this podcast, would never have let that happen. But he tried really fucking hard to quiet the way that you engaged with people who did love you, and I think could see how you were showing up and bring you more into his own circle and, take you away from those safety zones. I think about that all the time. It was very calculated.
It's interesting, the chipping away at my sense of self. And I think what was really important and, for people listening, and I could be off about your intention behind this, but it wasn't just, physically isolating me from people. It wasn't taking all of my time. It wasn't trying to withdraw me from the things that held me together, like my workplace. It was saying things to me about my physical appearance, about my worth, about how other people saw me. And it was subtle, but it was impactful. And I think you and I have had these conversations about, I've always been, I know what I look like and I know who I am. And I'm pretty okay with that. Like, I'm pretty happy with what, I was given at birth. And he would say things to me, like, "I'm the only one who can see the value in you." And, it wasn't those words exactly, but it would be like, "You're beautiful, but you're unconventionally beautiful. No one else can see it." Or maybe you could try Ozempic. Just little things that would chip away at these things that I was so confident in who I was. But then I had people around me that would be like, "You fucking what, mate?" Like, and, I had champions in my life that would remind me, actually, in fact, everyone can see how wonderful you are. That's not a special Danny radar. Everybody knows. And so these were things he just could never take away. And I think that's the important part, right? It's those little reminders from people. And I think that's what you and everybody around me did really well. The constant reminders of, actually, we can see your value and we can still see you. You're still there. If you were to talk to someone who was the Keeks in a similar dynamic, what would you tell them not to do?
This is a really hard question because every situation is a different one. And in no way do I ever want to be responsible for giving someone a Bible to say this is how you support someone who is going through a abusive relationship. Every human is different, every situation is different. So first and foremost, I think the one thing I've observed and felt to be true is being another layer of disappointment or setting being someone who can create another layer of expectation only to allow that person who's going through what they're going through to feel your own disappointment is just adding to the bullshit of it. We all have an understanding or a hope for things, how things are going to go, but you sort of have to just suspend your logical interpretation of a relationship or a timeline or an expectation of what someone should do or what they shouldn't do or a judgment on how they act or don't act because it's not a normal thing and you have to take yourself out of it because you are not in it. It's not a bad relationship you've been in before. It's not a bad breakup. Nothing about this is a normal situation. The best thing that you can be for someone going through something like what you did is a lifeline. And sometimes that means shutting the fuck up. You didn't need to feel me be disappointed with you. You didn't need to feel my feelings about your boyfriend. You just needed to know that there were people around you.
Do you know something I often think about now? I often think back and go, was there a point where I probably could have reached out to a support service? Did you ever think about seeking support, getting advice?
I have in other situations, not yours, and I have been in a situation where my brother, who I completely adore and love with all of my heart, was going through very, very complicated PTSD, as a lot of veterans do, and called me in a moment of panic and terror and a really scary PTSD episode. And he was very far away from me when this happened. And it was the middle of the night, and I had absolutely no idea what to do. But I knew we wouldn't be able to stay on the phone forever. And the second that phone call hung up, I called Beyond Blue. And I didn't know what I wanted from them. All I knew was that I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how scared I needed to be. I didn't know whether or not the terror I was feeling in every aspect of my body was justified or related to the fact that it was 2 o'clock in the morning. And so I absolutely reached out to Beyond Blue in that moment. I had a conversation with someone who helped me to understand what I could do and what I couldn't do and provided some sort of guidance for me. And that was invaluable. And I would absolutely recommend it. But I think in coming back to the story of you and Danny, I kind of rolled the dice a bit when we walked away from that catch up that we had, and decided to dig my heels in and to annoyingly not go away.
I want to add, if you're supporting someone through abuse, you're allowed to find it horrifying and you're allowed to feel angry and you're allowed to feel exhausted. That doesn't make you a selfish person. That makes you a human. And it's like the Titanic after it hits the iceberg and it's got this big gaping hole. And I was saying to you, oh no, I just need to give it a lick of paint.
Exactly. And there's no perfect way to handle a completely imperfect situation. But for me, I chose to stick by you in the way that I did because I knew that you would come back to yourself. And that ties really well back into the whole theme of this episode, which has been about the choices that everybody made. And you made and had to make some pretty major ones in September.
Yeah, I did make a choice, and that was informed by multiple things. I thought genuinely that, different environment, everything had changed. Maybe this is the setting we need for things to get better. September was just a fucking mess. If I'm being entirely honest, it was not what I thought at all.
And so you went into September thinking, I've made this decision. The relationship has finished as much as it felt like it could be at that stage, but you were still tethered to him. And so you were showing up to help him clean up his life. And I think it's important to talk as well about the kids because you weren't just helping him to quote unquote clean up his life to help him. It was for them as well because you had a genuine connection with them, right?
I did. And I also had this fantasy in my head that we would live this life together eventually. I didn't want it to be the end of our relationship. I really didn't. And whilst I knew I had to leave him at that point, I still had the hope of change.
But what was the reality of the situation that you walked into?
I don't think we've got enough time to talk about all of the things that happened that month, but the volatility had, I spent a lot more time at his home because I didn't have to go to work. What shocked me the most at first was the people that suddenly had entered his life. And this is coming off the back of me hearing from him while I'm overseas saying that he is so scared to misstep because he's afraid he'll do something that disappoints me or that I don't like. And so he painted this picture of him sitting alone on his couch waiting for me to return. And then when I do return, suddenly there's all these new friends in his life. One gentleman stands out to me. He had explained that he was helping this guy through a really bad breakup. And he'd met him and they had hit it off, and he was really clean and healthy guy. He didn't even drink, and his girlfriend had been treating him horribly, and so they had kicked off this really deep friendship, all while Danny was sitting at home alone, not talking to anyone. So it was just really inconsistent with the picture that he had painted for me while I wasn't there. One night, this gentleman shows up unannounced, and the first thing I clock is that he walks in with a tallie of VB in a brown paper bag.
This is the guy who didn't drink.
The guy who didn't drink. And so an immediate inconsistent part of the story had made itself apparent. And then he ended up staying the whole night. Like, I mean, he didn't leave till after midnight. And, I was at Danny's house because we were meant to be building this bathroom. And so I recall Danny's like, "Oh, well, no, he's gonna help me with this flat pack." And I'm like, "Okay." So I left them to their own devices. I didn't want to be in the room with them. He was going through some things, so I gave them some privacy. What I did was I went upstairs and I started cleaning because that's how I felt control. I cleaned. And so I just recall I was like maniacally cleaning upstairs. And then, before I know it, it's after midnight and he's still there. And so I go downstairs and this flat pack is still like on the floor, still very much flat.
What's interesting to me in this part too is the micro lies. We know he lied about so many things, but all of those little lies just build up and build up. And it's amazing to me that he could keep track of them. So in this situation, here is this clean cut guy who's a really solid influence on his life, who is physically standing in front of you, not presenting as that at all. He's come to help me do this thing, which didn't happen at all. It's all of these little micro lies that he's just sort of dangling and flaunting in front of you. It's very interesting.
It wasn't that I couldn't see the lies. It was that I could very much see them, and I could see them building up, and every new lie chipped away at this part of me going, Danny isn't the person that you are hoping he should be. And so it wasn't just the lies, it was the insult to my intelligence. And I think it was that he knew he had me in a position where I couldn't challenge him at all.
Right? And he was just getting more and more brazen with it. And it's exactly like that, because he still wanted, you had made this big thing. And I think he knew that you were serious about leaving when you said you were going to leave him. And he was testing your allegiance. He was testing in these little ways how to regain control. And so every time he said to you, he doesn't drink, he's a great influence, and then showed you he wasn't, he was giving you an opportunity to challenge him. And every time you didn't, because you couldn't, he was winning a little bit more control back. And every time you did challenge him, it gave him the opportunity to double down and just amp up that abuse. And I think it was incredibly manipulative at this point. I think he didn't give a fuck later, but at this stage, I think it was really calculated.
I think my expectation, my naive expectation, was that the fear of me going was what was going to help him change his mind. And it was kind of exactly what you say. He was doubling down to see how he could regain control. That rings true to so many things that happened that month, because I can think of lots of small examples of just wild things where I'm like, who does that? And Danny does that. That's what was happening. But, I was on a phone call to you, and I remember it was a good day and we were having a happy, fun conversation. And Danny sort of walks up to me and indicates that, time to go to bed. And I didn't think it was a bad thing at the time. That night, I was asleep and I heard someone downstairs and I panicked because I was like, oh shit, has someone broken in? And so I got up and I could hear someone in his clinic. And so I walked a little bit closer, put my ear to the door, and I could hear people in there having sex. And I was just like, what is going on? Someone's broken into his clinic and they're having sex in there. And so I went upstairs and I said, Danny, someone's in your clinic. And he said, oh yeah, I know. It's just such and such. She's staying here the night. And I said, well, she's having sex with someone, which eventually led to a fight because I couldn't understand. One, he didn't tell me that she was in his house. He'd slipped her in while I was on the phone to you. Two, like, why wouldn't you take that opportunity to introduce your friend to your girlfriend if she's staying the night? But three, why the fuck was she having sex with someone in his clinic.
I mean, didn't he have patients the next day? There's so much wrong with that. That's not just not telling you that someone's gonna come over and stay the night, that someone's gonna come over and stay the night and bring a guest over. It's his clinic where he sees patients.
And this is my life at this point, right? I was constantly cleaning up after him, and then I slowly learned I'm not just cleaning up after him, I'm cleaning up after a whole community of hims. That night was bad. It ended up in me being kicked out of the house because I had confronted him about this strange situation, and then he didn't like me telling him what he can and can't do with his own home. It was just a lot of things like that in September. There was another time where I was talking to him about a bathroom renovation because he decided he wanted another bathroom put in, and so he's telling me about all these niches that he wants put in, and I was kinda like, "There's a lot of niches. You don't need that many niches," and I was like, "They're a lot of work." It was just a stupid conversation, and I was getting overwhelmed thinking, "Why would you want that many niches? It would look stupid," but I didn't wanna tell him it was a stupid thing. He's like, "I'll do it. You don't have to do it. You don't have to worry about it. Don't think about it." And I just said to him, "Okay, well, I won't think then." And so, ironically, he starts abusing me for suggesting that he is an abusive person. It was getting really bad, and this is a matter of days. Things would happen, and it would be good, and then it would just suddenly be bad, and then it would be good, and then something stupidly wild would happen again, and so my reparative September turned into a dumpster fire.
This was a particularly scary time for people supporting you as well because you got really quiet and you were really consumed in this with him. And there were not many occasions where you were spending time with people who weren't Danny. So it was a very dangerous month for you and a very powerful month for him because he had complete and full access to you.
There was a lot going on in my head at this point. I had exposed a lot of what had been going on in our relationship, and then I had sort of made this stand to everybody that I was leaving, and then I didn't. And so I had sunk into a shame of going, "This can't fail now," because I've gone back on my word. I was actively hiding things that were happening, but I was also so wrapped up in it. This was very loud all of the time in my head. And I was not well physically during September either. I wasn't well physically because I had been diagnosed with chlamydia and I just couldn't catch my breath. And then that happens. And it wasn't just that I was diagnosed with chlamydia, it's that I was diagnosed with a sexually transmitted infection, but I hadn't had sex with anybody else. And he had this alleged gang rape hanging over us. And so there was that excuse, but also I didn't think he was actually gang raped. So it was kind of this confirmation that something had happened. And so I was really confused. And then when I told him about it, he kind of initially had turned it into a ha ha ha, that's hilarious.
Sorry, he made it hilarious?
Yeah, he literally, in his response to me, wrote, "Ha ha 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 ha. It's very funny that I have chlamydia." And I could see now, I can see now, this was kind of him being hit in the face with a, "Oh shit, she's found something out," and trying to buy deflection time, I suppose. I don't know. That's what makes sense to me. I'm like trying not to set him off because I'm trying to be really controlled and not say anything too contentious or anything that would spark any kind of conflict, but I'm also really confused about why I have this infection, and so I say, "Okay, well, I've got it and we need treatment and you need treatment because we've been together." And then the conversation sort of flipped into, "Well, how did it come about?" And then it became "You caught chlamydia. It's from you. You're the one." There were suggestions that I had been with other people in Europe, and so I had brought this into our relationship. He then spoke to me about past relationships I had, and I said, "Well, I know I'm really careful about my sexual health, and, I don't know if everybody does this, but I keep a list of people that I've slept with and the times that I have sexual health checks and pap smears so that I can keep track of my sexual health. It's just who I am, I make my bed every morning and I have a list." And so that then became something that he could weaponize and use to abuse me. That was not me being responsible with my sexual health. All of a sudden, that was me having proof of ranking men. And so that conversation came back into the fold. And so I started to get abused because I had this list. And he wasn't on it. But he wasn't on it because I was in a relationship with him.
To leave the list aside for a second, immediate reaction of, oh, you were obviously with people in Europe. With what time, Danny? In between the absolute bonkers bullshit that was coming down the line from him and hanging out with your family, with what time were you out there meeting these people enough? And the gall to suggest that that is a more likely explanation than this alleged gang rape that he has told you about that occurred at around the same time is just a bizarre part of this story for me too. It puts you in a really strange position from a psychological standpoint too, because on the one hand, you're sitting down with this doctor that you have known for most of your life who is really gently and kindly and consciously saying, I'm so sorry to tell you this, Jess, but look, you've got this sexually transmitted disease. I'm so sorry, because she knew you were in a committed relationship. And on the other
Yeah.
hand, you had doubts about the legitimacy of the gang rape claim. But how do you talk to somebody about whether or not maybe that's the root cause of where this thing came from without also then opening up a gate to talk about what really happened or what didn't really happen because you knew you were just going to get lies back?
He just wanted to create this really unsettling, disastrous conversation around it all so that I would just back off. And it worked because at the end of the whole thing, I just backed off and I said, I've got it. I need to take these 2 pills and we're good. Please go and get tested yourself and get treated yourself.
Did the list come back up again in your relationship?
Constantly. It was always somewhere we landed was me devaluing him, me wanting white men with tattoos, me keeping a list and ranking men on that list. And it would come up at the end of other arguments as well. We would start an argument about nothingness. Like one day I was doing the bathroom renovations upstairs and he came up to me and he was angry and I couldn't understand what he was angry about. But I'm doing work for him, free labor for him. And this guy walks up behind me suddenly all grumpy as if I'd done something wrong. And I asked him what was wrong. And he told me he'd been thinking about it's not funny, but it kind of is funny because it's so ridiculous. He'd been thinking about how when I was in my early 20s, I had the opportunity to party and I did recreational drugs and I, you know, slept with multiple people when I was younger. And he was studying and got a PhD and had children, and he didn't get to do these things. And because I had reached a point in my life where I didn't want to do that anymore, he was going to miss out. And so he was angry at me for wanting to grow up, I guess. And so I couldn't put that together in my head. I was just so confused. I'm like, here I am with a fucking multi-tool in my hand, cutting a hole in your bathroom wall to build you another niche. And you're mad that you can't do some MDMA and go to a party because we're fucking
Yeah, let's
adults
just
now?
clarify this. He's talking about, your lifestyle in your early 20s. He's a 40-plus-year-old man who's divorced with 2 children.
And that's what I said to him. I was like, oh no, Danny, you poor thing. Oh no, you've got a PhD and beautiful children. September for me was the most unconsciously conscious abusive month of our entire relationship.
And that, I think, makes a lot of sense because so much happened and nothing happened at all. It wasn't different to the month before. The level of insanity wasn't different. It was just louder, and he was getting more brazen with it because, you were pushing back a little bit more. And I think what I really observed, and especially hearing it again, is escalation. He was really escalating.
And in multiple ways, like even towards the end of the month, just before I was due to go back to work, and you and I had agreed to go have a lunch together, and we'd had a couple of drinks, and you and I really didn't have any plans but lunch, and there were no time limits on that. But suddenly there were because he, on that very day, decided that he needed to surprise me with a gift, which would mean that I would have to cut my lunch short with you. At the time, I didn't think about it, but then when you look back and you're like, what a strange thing. He rarely did much for me at all. And that one day that I had a reprieve to go and see you and have lunch with you, he had to cut that short. it was escalating in all kinds of ways, but isolation was certainly part of that as well. And so the more isolated I got, the harder things got as
It's
well.
interesting, you also and we talked about this at that lunch, we talked about whether or not you were ready to go back to work, and I remember saying to you, "I don't think you are," and the reason I was saying I don't think you are is because you had an entire body rash. Your like, the top half of your entire chest was covered in hives, and we were talking about it a little at the time, but I remember saying to you, "I don't think you're ready to go back to work," and you were really adamant that you were, and I sort of wonder if you were just needing to get back to a place of safety that wasn't 100% about him.
I think so. I remember the night before I went back to work and I stayed at Danny's house, which is a drive away, like, it's not close to work, and so that whole night was another fight. I remember being in tears because not because we were fighting, but because I just wanted to sleep. I just wanted to have a full night's sleep before I went back to work, and he it just didn't happen. I remember crying, saying, "Please, can we just I just want to get a full night's sleep tonight because I have to drive a long distance in the morning and I have to start back at my job." And it just makes me really sad for myself looking back at those moments. Like, just leave, girl. Just get
But I
out.
think it's also I think it's still amazing you were trying so hard still to be this incredibly centered, remarkable person, and coming back to that idea of choices, you were still choosing him all the time, and you were choosing his kids, and that leads into a really big thing you had to decide to do, which was to meet his ex-wife when you're already feeling the way you were feeling. I can imagine that that was a terrifying thought.
I'm glad you brought that up because it wasn't as simple as just leaving, just going home and being comfortable because the children had become involved and he was using that as well. He was reminding me that that was another choice I'd made. I'd made the choice to enter their lives, and so I had an obligation to not just exit their lives. I was committed to being there as his partner for them, and that was a choice I made, I think, more for myself because that was the joy of our relationship by this point. That was the beautiful part. I felt like we were moving forward in that aspect of our relationship. That was one thing that was progressing. And we had got to a point where they were spending time at my house. They come to my house. And so we thought maybe it'd be nice if they could stay the night rather than having to travel so much. But for that to happen, I had to meet their mother. Of course, I had to meet their mother. She needed to know where her children were spending time. And so Danny had arranged a time for me to meet her. And I was kind of awkward about it because it was at a children's birthday party. And I didn't really want that to be the place where I was being introduced to his ex-wife and the mother of his children. So I kind of said, "Can we figure out another time?" And I thought he understood that. And then it got to the Friday night and he messages me asking where I am. And I was like, "Well, I'm at home." And he's like, "Oh, you're not coming? We'll have to get up early in the morning to go meet them." And so I was shocked because I thought we'd agreed to do it some other way. No, that wasn't what was happening at all. So I got in my car and I went to his house and I prepared myself to meet his ex-wife. And I was quietly shitting my pants. Like, I was really nervous about this for many reasons. But this is the mother of his children who I care about a lot. And I wanted to make a good impression. I wanted her to see that I was a safe person for them. But that night, it was not a good night. He was angry at me. I think we were having another fight about this list and me wanting big dicks again. And so it was just another night of sleep deprivation and angry Danny. And so it gets to the morning and we have to go to this birthday party. And I got out of bed and he was in a foul mood. And I can't even tell you what the conversation was. I just recall there was a point he threw something really hard across the room and then he stormed out of the room and I got up to get dressed and, I wasn't feeling great about myself. I had an STI. I wasn't feeling really confident in my body anymore. And I was really anxious about meeting this woman. And so I get dressed and I recall walking to the bathroom and he was in the bathroom and he kind of looks at me angrily. And I just said to him, "Danny, I just want to get dressed." And he all of a sudden punched the wall, the tiled wall, really hard next to my head and storms out of the bathroom. And I was just in shock. I didn't know what was happening. He was just in a rage for no reason. And so I just continued to get dressed. It was a matter of 5 minutes we had to be at this party.
That's a really pointed act of violence, actually. What did that feel like?
It felt like pure anxiety. It felt like someone had lit my nervous system on fire. I think I immediately go into fight or flight. This is where I was at. But at this point, they talk about fawn. And so my response is to kind of just want to calm the situation down and soothe him for whatever's going on in his brain. I had no idea what had happened to him. I don't even remember getting from that point where he punched the wall to being in the car, but I recall being in the car on the way to this birthday party, and he's on the phone to his friend, and they were just laughing and joking about how anxious I was to meet his ex-wife, as if that was funny all of a sudden. The rage was gone, it was a joke now. And so we get to this party, and it was fine. I meet her, she was fine, she was very pleasant to me. I could see she was somewhat anxious. He was not anxious at all. He did his usual walk in and steal the show act, and it was fine. And then we spent the day with the kids afterwards. I think we had another birthday party to go to, and so I think I was just holding my breath the whole day, waiting for it to be over. And it got to the end of the day. Danny was taking the children home, and I was in his room, and I noticed in the corner of my eye there were lots of fruit flies around his bin. And so, I had to keep everything clean. So I go over to his bin and I go to empty it. And as I'm emptying it, I find that there is a used condom in there. And then my heart just fell out. I was just heartbroken immediately because, you find a condom in your boyfriend's bin that it isn't one you've used, and things start to fall into
Well,
place.
especially because he'd been constantly abusing you over a list that you kept in your phone that had sexual health at its core, while also suggesting that you were the reason that this STI had come into existence in the first place. And right there in front of you is just another indicator of a lie.
As soon as I found that condom, I called him. I attempted to call him. I just panicked. My heart was, I hadn't slept the whole night before. My nervous system had drained the shit out of me all day. And then this happens. And so I immediately tried to call him. And I called and he wasn't answering, and I called and he wasn't answering. And so I just sat there on his bed. I didn't know what to do. And I waited for him to get home. And when he got home, he'd seen all these missed calls, and he rushes up and he's like, "Are you okay? What's going on?" Suddenly, very gentle, very caring Danny appears. And I just pointed out to him and I said, "Is this why I have chlamydia?" And let him know that I found a condom in his bin. And of course, he had a story, and it wasn't his. His story was that he'd let a friend use his bedroom because she had to sleep with someone for some very important reason, and Danny came to the rescue and said she could use his room. And so I was immediately like, who? What on earth?
While you were at not one but two children's birthday parties meeting his ex-wife, he's just letting his friends come and have sex in the house.
It is entirely bizarre. I wanted to believe him because that's better than thinking that it was his, that he was sleeping with someone else. But then I was kind of like, is it? You let someone come in and use the bed that I sleep in with you every night? And so I wanted to know logistics then. I was like, what? How? Again, it's not funny, but it's just so ridiculous that it's kind of funny. And so then he says, I can prove it. He's like, come with me to my car to get my phone so you know I'm not manipulating this situation. And I will text them so you can see that I'm not lying to you. And so he does. He texts this woman and she confirms, oh, sorry, I forgot to take that out. He had said to me earlier on that, they'd agreed that she would bring her own sheets. And so I said, can you at least confirm with her that she'd changed the sheets? Because it all looked the same to me. And so he texts her and she says, oh, we threw down a towel. And I was just in a different
This
place by
is
this
so
point.
disgusting.
It's just a little bit wrong. It's not okay for so many reasons, but I didn't even know who this person was. Their name was so not familiar to me. Never brought them up before. Like, I don't think And I love you, Keeks, but I'm not sure I'd let you do that in my room, let alone some rando that he'd met while I was
Jessica,
overseas.
if you did that on my bed, I'd burn the bed and just start again.
Right? And I would appreciate that. I would understand why. And so
Because we're not.
there's
Sorry, I just want to be a bit outraged for a second because we're not 18. And that's the other aspect of this. Oh, okay, whatever this story. Okay, sure. He's not an 18-year-old. He is a 40-plus-year-old man who has children and a very important career where he looks after vulnerable people in the same place that he is carrying on like he is an 18-year-old. It's not fine. None of this is fine. You're in a relationship with someone you don't know at this point who is making it out like you are the crazy person for suggesting you don't know them and for asking to be more safe than you were. A lot of this is so fucked up because how can you choose to be in a relationship with someone who is not telling you the truth about who they actually are and then blaming you for not knowing who they are and accepting them?
exactly. And like I would like to think maybe this is some kind of form of arrested development, but I think it is more sinister than that. There is a undercurrent of just really insidious, dangerous behaviors.
You're exactly right. The sinister aspect of this goes even deeper because there are a lot of people who couldn't give informed consent to even being in the house. So he still wanted to have his children in that house, but it had become like a little bit of a drop in center for people with very sketchy, shady pasts, presents, and proclivities. How can his children consent to safety? How can the person he's co-parenting with consent to their children's safety when it's all a little bit strange what's really going on there? And further to that, his clinic was attached to his house. So these are very vulnerable people who are entering a situation, giving over a lot of their own vulnerability to somebody and asking them to be gentle and safe with it in an environment that is incredibly unsafe objectively. It's actually really scary.
And these are just the things that I knew about, that I happened upon, that he didn't disclose to me. The only things I know because I found them. I can't imagine how deep this runs. I don't know what he was getting up to when I was out of sight. And so that was in the back of my mind as well, is thinking, oh, I've scratched something here. And
And
so
you were texting me a little bit. Well, no, that's not true. I was texting you a little bit about some very unrelated things. And you kind of very jokingly, in the way that you do, said, how about the one where you find a used condom in your boyfriend's bin and were telling me sort of surface level details, but you said something to me which I think is really important, is that you wanted to leave that house and never go back to it. And it wasn't the first time you had shared that sort of sentiment, not him, but the house. I think that for a long time you had felt very unsafe being in that house.
this is entirely true. I think the house was somewhat a scapegoat for his bad behavior, which is not a great thing either because it wasn't the house at all, it was him. But yeah, that house became this symbol of abuse, essentially. I went there and I got abused and I did not want to walk back into it. That evening was one of the most horrible nights I'd had with him. Now that I think about it, you and I were texting a little bit. I was getting a little bit spicy because I was very hurt at this point and I didn't know how to process what was being said to me. And so you and I had been texting about it. And very strangely, everything flipped. And all of a sudden, Danny was really upset because I'd received a text message from my friend Jeremy, who lives in America. And suddenly that was inappropriate. And so he left the room and came back in and said to me, I know, let's switch phones. And of course I said, no, absolutely not. Not that I had been deceiving him in any kind of way, but there were private conversations on my phone that I didn't want him to see. I didn't want him to read our communications. And so that was an immediate no. But looking back on it now, it's very strange that given what you and I were talking about, all of a sudden he got very angry. And I could, you know, if I was a conspiracy theorist, I would suggest that maybe he had some kind of insight into what we had been talking about, and that angered him.
Well, I'm going to go a step further than that and say I genuinely think that he had access to your phone for a long time. And we have reasons now to think that that is the case. But it's interesting reflecting on it because I think he had read the not so nice messages that I was sending, and I stand by every word that I said in them because it was me reacting to something that you had said, and I reacted in the way that a friend normally would react to finding out that their
Right.
friend's partner had a used condom in the bed that wasn't theirs, and I think he had access to that and reacted to it.
That night was one of the clearest demonstrations of abuse in our relationship. I was trying to defend myself because he had flipped the narrative that it wasn't about the fact that I'd found this condom in his bin. It was that I'd received a text message from a man that he didn't think I had in my life anymore, which perplexed me because I swear he knew that this person was in my life. I recall talking to him about texts that I'd received from him in the past. But then it kind of fell into a whole other narrative of everything that he had ever abused me about in the past. So he was interrogating me about all kinds of things. And I just want to set the scene a little bit because I think to put people in that situation and understand why I just didn't get up and leave the room, I think that's probably the first question that a lot of people would ask. Why don't you just go? I was trained by this point. He had told me over and over again, the worst thing that I can do is leave the room when we're in conflict. And if I had done that in the past, it would result in a whole night of abuse via text message anyway. So I had been trained to stay in the room to withstand whatever he was giving me. But I still hadn't developed the skills to communicate within conflict, and particularly within conflict that is so confusing. It just doesn't make any sense. It's not grounded on anything that is true. So I was positioned on the end of his bed, and he had craftily put a chair in the corner of the room, and he had sat down in the chair, and it was in his body language. He sat back on the chair. He was very relaxed and comfortable. He was in a position of power. And he sat back on this chair and he started asking me questions about things that I couldn't respond to. There was no answer. It was just things like, "Do you tell your friend you love them?" And I'd say, "Of course I did. I've known this person over 10 years. Of course we say to each other, 'I love you.' That is a loving friendship." "Do you mention the word dick?" And I'd say, "I don't know, maybe." And then it would be, "Do a search in your phone and show me every time you've said the word dick to this person." So it started with just this ridiculous interrogation that immediately made me feel like I was a child in that situation. There were questions about how often I'd been racist in my life. There w I can't explain the ridiculousness of the line of questioning that was happening, but I can tell you how I felt at the time. I felt entirely panicked, and you need to remember I hadn't slept the night before. I had been shocked out of my body in the morning when he was getting violently rageful. I had met his ex-wife, and I had been incredibly anxious about that. I then found a condom in his bin, and I also had chlamydia. Like, there were just so many compounding factors here. And so I'm sitting on the end of the bed. I eventually somehow ended up on the floor while he continued this line of interrogation. And I remember he would get up and leave the room, and then he would come back in. He'd say, "I need a minute," and he needed a minute. So he had to get up and leave and come back in. And I just couldn't even talk at this point. I was just sobbing. I couldn't look at him. And I recall him saying to me, "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." I felt like I was sitting in front of my angry father. And so this went on for hours. He then started referring to people, saying he had talked to these friends of his, telling me what they think about the things that I'd done. There was another moment I remember he got up and he's like, "You can leave. You're not a prisoner in this room." I think he very well knew I couldn't leave. I think he knew where he had me at that point, and that was just a point he was making. And so I think he got tired in the end. I think it ended because he got tired. And so I wasn't answering his questions. I hadn't satisfied what he needed. So he told me to get out. And so I packed my bags. I got up to leave. And he then stopped me on my way out. And then he softened all of a sudden. And he said to me, "You can stay, but I just need you to explain something to me." And so I just paused. I couldn't talk. And I didn't want to look at him. And I remember walking into his wardrobe and hiding my face, just looking into the corner of the wardrobe, hiding from him. And I could hear him saying to me, "I found a bag in your closet and it had condoms in it. What were they about?" And I had no idea what he was talking about. I was just perplexed. I was like, I don't know. I use this bag all the time. I don't know what you're talking about. What bag?" And he's like, "You know what bag I'm talking about." No idea. Couldn't answer the question. Just panicking because I just wanted to answer the questions correctly. I just wanted it to be over. And so he then escalated again because I had these condoms in my closet and it means I was the cheating party. It also kind of hit me at that moment that, "Oh, you've been going through my things. You've been going through my closet. He was in my home when I was overseas. What was he doing in my room?" Like, I didn't have anything to hide. But at the same time, it's like this whole layer of who this person could be. Does he have access to my phone? Has he been looking through my belongings? Is this element of control that I just didn't even fathom because everything else was so chaotic and loud. I just didn't even thought about that part. I again wasn't satisfying him and he told me to get out. He kicked me out of the house. And so
What time was this?
I think this would have been after midnight by this point. It had been hours. This had been going on for hours. And I was exhausted and I couldn't drive. And so I just went and sat in my car and I sent him a message saying, "I'm just going to sit out the front of my car. I'm going to have a sleep." And he came out to the car after that and he tapped on the window and he says to me, "You can come back into this house when you can learn to accept who I am and respect me and my children." And I didn't wanna go back into the house. I said to him, "I'm just gonna sleep here until I can go home, and then we're done. You don't ever have to see me again." As if I was the problem. And so he leaves eventually, and I'm sitting in my car, and I could see him in my rearview mirror, and he's standing in his garage, and I see him pull out a glass pipe, and I could see him lighting it up, and then I panicked because I knew he had the children the next day, and I was like, "What are you doing? What is this?" So I get out of my car and I went over to him and I just said, "Please stop, Danny. What are you thinking? What are you doing?" He sort of dismissed it a little bit and said, "It's just the leftovers. There's nothing in it." And I said, "Can you please just put it away and I will come in and we can lie down and just go to sleep. Please just come upstairs with me." And so he does. And we go up to the bed, we lie down, and at this point, I couldn't stop shaking and I was sobbing. And that annoyed him. He didn't like hearing the fact that I was in distress. And I wasn't trying to sob loudly, I just couldn't help it. And so he angered again and told me to get the fuck out because he couldn't stand it. And so I did. And I drove home somehow. I don't remember the drive home, but I got home and then the usual slew of text messages comes in from him. The "I'm dissociating" text messages now. It was suddenly Danny was vulnerable and I needed to pick up pieces. And that went all the way through to the next morning. And then I remember he was texting me saying he had gone to get his children, but he was meeting his ex-wife at a market. And he said, "Oh, she thought you were gonna be here. The kids told her you were gonna be here. What do I do? What do I say to her?" And I was like, "Why on earth would she think I was gonna be there? We hadn't made plans for me to be there. This is odd." And then he told me she saw him have a psychotic break, and now he's in trouble, and she's seen everything, and she's taken the kids. And again, I was at a point where I was exhausted and I was angry at him for so many reasons, but then all of a sudden I suddenly felt responsible for what had happened. I should have been there. Oh no, he's been exposed because I didn't show up the next day or I went home. Going back and having a look at the messages, even from the moment that I left at his home at like 4 a.m. in the morning, we were in constant communication. He was still pulling the same tactics out. It was still this, "It's my fault," and suddenly he was angry at me again, but then he softened, and it's like he was running through his book of tricks, and I I can't.
If I can just offer an observation on it, because you're right, we did go back and have a look at the messages, and we were looking to try to find the time between me asking you if you were okay in the morning and you eventually letting me know that you were not okay in that afternoon. And in doing that, and I think I've said this 6 or 7 times in this episode, I didn't know how bad it was. And I've heard this story a lot of times at this stage. We've talked about this night and the aftermath of it a few times, but reading the cycle was a chilling experience, if I can be frank. So it starts off with you sending a really almost incoherent sentence at 1 o'clock in the morning asking to sleep, and him making sure that you know that you are vile, that you are the problem, that you have vilified him, that people see you, that people know how awful you are, to then jumping into, I'm the abuser, Jesse, I abuse you, I abuse you, I am the problem, please, please talk to me, oh my God, I thought I was blocked. Hours, to then jumping to an hour-long conversation at 5:30 AM, to constant messages over and over and over again. Constant, to, between the hours of 8 AM and 9 AM, you flipping into the place of being his caregiver. Are you okay? What's happened? What's going on? When he lets you know that because you're not there, he's gonna lose his children. And it's quite wild, to you letting him know he's had a big night. You still love him, but the best thing for you to do is to not be together. But he's had a really big night. It was awful for him. It is so calculating to read it back. And that's in no way a reflection or a judgment from me on the words coming out of your mouth. Because reading it like that, an angry person who was in control started the conversation, and that person turned into a little boy who needed help, and you being the one person who could help him, and you flipping back into the role where he was again in power. It just looked a little bit different to the person who'd been interrogating you for 8 hours straight at the end of the bed about every thought you'd ever had in your life. I've never read anything like it, Jess.
Yeah, it's exhausting to read through. I feel so bad for the person I was. I can't relate to that person, but I can understand what he was doing now, and I think that's really helpful because there's a lot of shame in that as well. There's talk about stripping someone of all power. Like, that was a humiliating time in my life, and I think it was also another point where I kinda knew it had hit this really dangerous, disastrous space. And so I needed to declare an end. I hadn't contacted you since the night before, and after, 2 nights of not sleeping, of wild abuse, of high anxiety, I had hit a point of complete collapse, and I had to be honest with you about it. And I had to be honest and tell you that it was over so that I knew it was over in my head. And so I remember I think I ended up texting you and said, "Hey, I lied. Things aren't great." And you came over and we had a great conversation where I could just be really honest with you. And it wasn't these are the details of what's happened. I think I was just honest with you about the level of abuse and unwellness that I was experiencing at that time. And I don't think you were shocked. I don't think you were surprised to
The
hear that.
only thing that was different was that you called it abuse, and it was the first time I'd ever heard you say that.
And it wasn't the first time I recognized it. It was that I need everybody to know now. Because that mantra I had, always tell someone what's happening. It's dangerous if you don't tell people, if you hide these things. Because what if you don't come back from it one day? It's pretty grim, but it's the reality. And I think it's the reality for a lot of people who live through abuse. During that conversation with you, you said something really helpful and it sticks out really brightly to me. You weren't judgmental at all. There was no judgment. It was a completely safe space for me to share what I needed to share. And you said to me, "What role do you want me to play here? Do you want me to be here and listen and support you? Or do you want me to be the person that reminds you what you're feeling now and how unwell you are now?" And then you left after that conversation, and I felt relief, but I was well aware that my phone had been buzzing the entire time you were there. And I picked it up and I looked through, and there were messages there. And I read the first one I read is, "In case you wanted to know, psychological research shows that people who talk to their friends about intricate details of their relationships are more dissatisfied with their friendships and relationships than people who seek emotional support but do not seek validation for actions." And I knew after reading that as much as I wanted it to be done, it wasn't really over.
Next time on Beyond Curious, we explore the nebulous, excruciating space between leaving and returning. The space where Jess begins to come back to herself, but remains caught in the gravity of something she knows she has to leave.